a Canadian Army captain walked into a command briefing at a forward operating base in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam in the spring of 1969, dropped a folder of documentation on the table in front of a United States Army colonel, and waited. The folder contained his jump wings, his Special Forces equivalency assessment, a letter from a two-star general at Canadian Forces headquarters in Ottawa attesting to his unconventional warfare qualifications, and a complete service record that documented 9 years of professional soldiering across 3 continents. He had crossed the border from Canada into the United States 2 years earlier, enlisted in the American Army on the strength of his Canadian military background, earned his Green Beret through a process that the Special Forces Qualification Course instructors at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, had considered, by every objective measure, exemplary. He had done everything right. He had proven himself through the same selection gauntlet that had washed out 60% of the American candidates who attempted it alongside him. He had completed his first tour as an A-team medic in the Highlands, treated wounds that would have killed a less trained man, called in fires that held positions the enemy outnumbered 4-1, and returned stateside to complete his officer candidate program before shipping back to Vietnam on his second tour. Now he was standing in that briefing room, folder open on the table, waiting for the American colonel to acknowledge what every piece of paper in front of him confirmed. What the colonel said instead would trigger a chain of events, a series of appeals, written protests, and quiet professional fury that would work its way through 2 separate military bureaucracies and eventually surface in a memorandum that no one on either side of the border particularly wanted to sign. 7 words, spoken flatly across a table covered in maps of contested jungle terrain. "Your training doesn't count here, Captain." Wait. What? A man who had served in the Canadian Army, who had voluntarily crossed a border to fight a war his own country refused to enter, who had completed the United States Army's most demanding qualification pipeline to earn the right to wear a Green Beret, who had already done 1 combat tour and come back alive and whole and ready to do another, was being told by a colonel who had never once questioned his credentials in the field that his credentials no longer applied in a briefing room? A man who had spent years building exactly the kind of multinational, cross-service operational profile that Special Operations Doctrine said it needed, was being told in a forward operating base headquarters that his professional background was the wrong kind of professional background? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because what the colonel in that briefing room was actually doing, though he would never have described it this way, was enforcing a set of unwritten institutional assumptions about who belonged in certain rooms making certain kinds of decisions. Assumptions so deeply embedded in the American military culture of 1969 that most of the officers present that morning would not have recognized them as assumptions at all. They would have called them standards. And buried in the paperwork that resulted from that confrontation, buried in the complaints and the responses and the eventual formal guidance that was issued months later, there is a sentence that reveals exactly what those standards were actually protecting. 12 words, bureaucratic in their phrasing, but devastating in their implications. Prior foreign service may not substitute for United States operational qualifications.
You are about to discover why the question of what counted as a Special Forces credential in Vietnam was not really a question about training at all. It was a question about belonging. And by the end of this, you will understand why the roughly 30,000 Canadians who served in American uniform during the Vietnam War, men who had volunteered for a war their own government refused to send them to, occupied a position in the alliance so strange and so unacknowledged that the official American military record of the war barely mentions them.
Stay with me. To understand what happened in that Central Highlands briefing room, you need to understand 2 things that the American military establishment of the late 1960s genuinely did not understand about itself. The first is what the Green Beret actually meant by 1969. The second is who Canadians were, professionally and institutionally, when they showed up in Vietnam. Start with the beret. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy had authorized the Special Forces to wear the distinctive green headgear that had been banned by conventional Army commanders who viewed it as an affectation incompatible with military uniformity. Kennedy's authorization transformed the Green Beret from a piece of headgear into a symbol, and symbols, once created, developed their own institutional gravity. By 1969, the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg had become not just a training pipeline, but a membership gate. Men who wore the beret had passed through something that most American soldiers had not passed through. They had survived selection, completed the long training sequence that covered everything from advanced medical procedures to foreign language study to the Baroque, stress-inoculating final exercise that SF candidates called Robin Sage, a notional unconventional warfare scenario conducted against real opposition in the pine forests of North Carolina. They had earned the right to be called, in the Special Forces' own preferred language, a quiet professional. But the gatekeeping function of the qualification course was inseparable from its national character. The Q course was an American course. It selected for American military culture. It taught American doctrine. Its standards were American standards, and when men graduated from it, they graduated into the American Special Forces, an institution with its own traditions, its own internal hierarchy, its own unwritten codes about who had earned the right to speak with authority in which rooms. The beret was not just a marker of capability, it was a marker of institutional membership. And institutional membership, as it turned out, was something you could not fully earn by completing the same training as everyone else, if you had arrived at that training from somewhere other than the American military system. Now understand the Canadians. Canada's official position on the Vietnam War was neutrality, which placed every Canadian who wanted to fight in the war in an extraordinary situation. The 1937 Foreign Enlistment Act technically made it illegal for Canadians to serve in the armed forces of a foreign country engaged in a conflict. In practice, the law was never enforced against Canadians who crossed the border to join the American military, and Canadian authorities were not particularly inclined to make an example of men who were walking toward a war rather than away from one. Approximately 30,000 Canadians served in American uniform during the Vietnam era. Around 12,000 of them were deployed to Southeast Asia. At least 134 were killed. The men who came from professional Canadian military backgrounds were a specific subset of this group. They were not draft-age civilians who had impulsively crossed the border. They were trained soldiers, often with years of service in the Canadian Army, who had made a deliberate professional choice. Some came because they wanted combat experience that peacetime Canada could not offer them. Some came because they believed in the strategic logic of containing communist expansion in Southeast Asia and felt a moral obligation to act on that belief even when their government declined to. Some came because the professional soldier's instinct, the one that runs deeper than political calculation and deeper than national loyalty, told them that this was the war of their generation and they did not want to watch it from the outside. Tom Tompkins was born in Amherst, Nova Scotia. He served 5 years in the Canadian Army before enlisting in the United States Army in 1963. By 1968, he was a Special Forces sergeant, completing his second tour in Vietnam near the Cambodian border. On October 30, 1968, he established a 6-man observation post on a rocky hilltop and held it against repeated North Vietnamese Army assaults despite multiple wounds, calling in medevacs and directing airstrikes until relief arrived. He was awarded the Bronze Star with a Valor Device and subsequently the Silver Star. To become eligible for Special Forces training, he had become an American citizen, because the security clearance requirements for Special Forces could not be met by foreign nationals in most cases. His story was not unique in its broad outline. It was the story of dozens of Canadians who had made similar choices, similar sacrifices, and earned similar recognition in ways the official record of the war quietly absorbed without ever quite acknowledging. But the Canadians who arrived in Vietnam with existing military credentials from the Canadian Forces occupied a stranger position than the ones who had simply enlisted young. The Canadian Army of the 1960s was not a negligible institution. It had fought in Korea. It had served in Malaya during the emergency alongside Commonwealth allies who were developing the counterinsurgency doctrine that the American military in Vietnam conspicuously lacked. Canadian Army officers had trained at Sandhurst and at the British Army staff colleges that had absorbed the lessons of the Malayan emergency and the Borneo confrontation. They had developed within the Commonwealth system an approach to small unit operations in difficult terrain that was rooted in patience, intelligence gathering, and the kind of low-signature fieldcraft that the American Army's firepower-heavy doctrine consistently deprioritized. When a Canadian officer arrived at Fort Bragg in the mid-1960s with a service record from the Canadian Forces and applied for Special Forces training, the institutional response varied. Sometimes the process was smooth. A man's records were evaluated, equivalencies were assessed, and he was admitted into the pipeline at a point that reflected his actual experience rather than making him repeat basic military skills he had already mastered years earlier. But sometimes the process was not smooth. Sometimes the institutional machinery that governed who was qualified to do what, and on what basis that qualification rested, encountered the Canadian applicant and produced friction that had nothing to do with the man's actual capabilities and everything to do with the machinery's assumptions about what counted. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was formally established on April 8, 1968, as a rapid reaction parachute force drawing on the lineage of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, and the 1st Special Service Force, the Joint American-Canadian Commando Unit, whose legacy both the Green Berets and their Canadian counterparts claimed as institutional ancestry. An officer from that lineage, arriving in Vietnam with jump wings and a service record from an organization that traced its roots to the same World War II special operations heritage as the American Special Forces, occupied a position in the institutional hierarchy of the alliance that was, to put it politely, undefined. Undefined, in military bureaucracies, tends to become contested. And contested, when the bureaucracy doing the contesting is the largest and most powerful military in the world, tends to become a problem for the smaller party. The 5th Special Forces Group was the primary American Special Forces organization operating in Vietnam. At its peak in 1969, it controlled operations across the entire country, running the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program that recruited and trained Highland minority fighters, known by the American acronym SIDG, into strike forces that operated across South Vietnam's most difficult terrain. The A-teams that formed the operational backbone of the 5th Group worked in a command environment that was, structurally, both highly autonomous and deeply hierarchical. At the team level, a 12-man A-team in a remote camp in the Central Highlands or the Mekong Delta operated with the kind of independence that most conventional military units never experienced. Decisions were made at the lowest level by the most experienced man present in conditions that changed faster than any headquarters could track. That was the nature of special operations. That was what the Q course was supposed to produce. Men who could function in the absence of direct supervision, who had internalized doctrine deeply enough to adapt it to conditions the doctrine writers had never anticipated. But above the team level, the fifth group had a conventional headquarters structure. It had colonels and staff officers and administrative systems and all the institutional paraphernalia that a large military organization generates to sustain itself. And those headquarters, like all headquarters, had their own institutional culture, their own assumptions about who was qualified to make which decisions, their own unwritten rules about the professional credentials that entitled a man to speak with authority in a given room. The men who commanded A teams were typically captains or senior lieutenants. They were, in the language of the Special Forces, fully qualified. That phrase, fully qualified, carried enormous weight. It meant you had gone through the Q course. It meant you had survived selection and training, and Robin Sage, and all the rest of it. It meant you were a member of the institution in the full sense, not just a man who was wearing the beret, but a man who had genuinely earned the right to wear it. The question of what fully qualified meant, for a man who had earned his credentials through a combination of Canadian military service and an accelerated American qualification process, was not a question that the fifth group's administrative machinery had a clean answer for. And in military bureaucracies, questions without clean answers do not quietly resolve themselves. They accumulate. They wait for a moment when the ambient pressure in the institution is high enough that the unresolved question suddenly becomes a problem that somebody has to deal with. The Central Highlands in the spring of 1969 were not a low-pressure environment. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had shattered the political consensus in the United States that was sustaining the war. American troop levels had peaked at over 500,000 men, and the Nixon administration was beginning to talk about Vietnamization, the process of transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, which would eventually mean that Special Forces A teams were going to be doing more training and less direct action. The institutional mood in the Fifth Group's headquarters was not one of relaxed confidence. It was one of an organization trying to redefine its mission while continuing to execute the old one at full tempo. Into this environment walked the Canadian captain. He had completed his officer candidate program. He was on his second tour. He had a Green Beret and a service record and a folder full of documentation that said in plain language that he was qualified to do what he was doing. He was being assigned to a new position, one that would give him oversight responsibilities that he had not previously held, and the briefing in the command center that morning was meant to establish the chain of command relationships and the operational parameters for that new assignment. When the colonel said those 7 words, "Your training doesn't count here, Captain," he was not saying that the man in front of him was incompetent. Everything in the man's service record contradicted that. He was saying something more subtle and more institutionally revealing. He was saying that the credential structure through which the captain had arrived at his current position did not map cleanly onto the credential structure that the colonel's mental model of his command required. The Canadian military background, the Commonwealth training heritage, the accelerated equivalency process that had admitted the captain into the Q-course pipeline, none of it was legible to the colonel in the way that a straightforward American military career would have been legible. And things that were not legible in a hierarchical institution under stress tended to get treated as insufficient. What the colonel was also saying, though he would almost certainly have denied this if asked directly, was that he did not trust a credential he had not issued. The Q course at Fort Bragg issued credentials. The Canadian forces issued different credentials. The equivalency process that translated one into the other had produced a result that looked right on paper but felt wrong to an officer whose entire career had been spent in an institution that had very specific ideas about how men earned the right to lead. The captain did not raise his voice. Men who had passed Special Forces selection did not, generally speaking, raise their voices in briefing rooms when colonels said things they disagreed with. They noted the disagreement, assessed it professionally, and then they used whatever means the institutional structure provided them to address it. What the captain did when he walked out of that briefing room was what professional soldiers do when they encounter an institutional failure that cannot be resolved at the local level. He wrote it down. He wrote it down in precise, measured language that left no room for ambiguity about what had been said and what had been implied. And then he sent that written account up his chain of command through the channels that his unusual institutional position made available to him. The chain of command question was itself part of the problem. A Canadian officer serving in the United States Army during the Vietnam War occupied an institutional position that had no formal doctrine governing it. He was, for administrative purposes, an American soldier. His pay, his orders, his evaluations, all of that ran through American channels. But he had arrived in the American Army from a different institutional background, and that background had produced a set of professional relationships and loyalties and reference points that did not disappear when he put on an American uniform. Other Canadians in the American military knew who he was. Canadian military attaches in Saigon knew his name. Canadian Forces Headquarters in Ottawa had an interest, informal and unacknowledged but genuine, in how Canadians serving in Vietnam were being treated by the institution they had joined. This informal network was not a command structure. It had no authority to issue orders or compel compliance, but it was a communication network, and in the late 1960s, when the political relationship between Canada and the United States over Vietnam was already strained by the fact that Canada was simultaneously hosting American draft resistors and selling war material to the American military, communication networks that connected individual soldiers to political sensitivities at the national level could move information very quickly to people who were very motivated to act on it. The captain's written account of the briefing room incident moved through those channels. It moved through the informal Canadian network in Saigon. It moved through the formal American Special Forces administrative chain, where officers at the group level who had worked with the captain and respected his capabilities found the colonel's position professionally indefensible. It moved, eventually, to a level of the alliance structure where the question was no longer about one captain in one briefing room, but about the institutional treatment of a broader category of people. Men who had served in Commonwealth or Allied militaries before entering American service, and who were finding that their prior service was being discounted in ways that had no relationship to their actual capability. The American military in Vietnam in 1969 had a complicated relationship with Allied forces and Allied credentialing. The Australians in Phuoc Thi Province had been fighting a running institutional battle with American command for years over the question of whether Australian methods and Australian doctrine were legitimate alternatives to American methods and American doctrine, or whether they were deviations from the correct approach that needed to be corrected. The South Koreans, whose two divisions operated in coastal enclaves along the Central Coast, maintained a fierce independence from American operational control that American commanders found frustrating and that the Koreans themselves considered non-negotiable. The various Asian Allied contingents, Thai and Filipino and others, all operated within command arrangements that reflected the political realities of their national commitments rather than the clean hierarchical logic that American military doctrine preferred. In this environment, the question of what counted as a valid military credential was not academic. It was a question that shaped who got to make decisions, who got to lead missions, who got to sit in briefing rooms and have their professional assessment treated as authoritative? And the answer to that question, in practice, was almost always the same. American credentials, issued by American institutions, validated by American processes, counted. Everything else was provisional. Provisional could mean many things. It could mean subject to additional review. It could mean acceptable for some purposes but not others. It could mean fine for carrying a rifle, but not quite right for sitting at the table where decisions get made. What it almost never meant, in the practice of 1969 Vietnam, was fully equivalent to the American standard in all respects. The irony of this position, when applied to a man with Special Forces credentials, was particularly acute. The Special Forces had been built, from their earliest institutional days in the early 1950s, on the premise that the most effective soldier in unconventional warfare was a man who could operate across cultural and national boundaries. The first Special Service Force, the Joint American-Canadian Commando Unit, whose legacy the Green Berets claimed, had been proof of that premise during World War II. A force drawn from two nations, trained together, deploying together into the most difficult operations of the Italian campaign, had produced results that neither nation's forces could have produced alone. The Green Berets' founding doctrine was built on the idea that the effective special operations soldier was a man who understood that military capability was not the exclusive property of any single national tradition. But doctrine and institutional practice do not always move together. By 1969, the Green Berets had developed an institutional identity that was, despite its doctrinal commitment to cross-cultural competence, intensely American. The Beret was American. The Q Course was American. The internal hierarchy that determined who spoke with authority in a Special Forces headquarters was an American hierarchy, built on American credentials, enforced by American institutional culture. A man who had arrived at those credentials by a slightly different route, who wore the same beret but had come to it from a background that included years in a Commonwealth Army, occupied a position in that hierarchy that the institution had never quite decided how to categorize. "Your training doesn't count here, Captain." 7 words that said, in effect, that the institution had made its decision. The formal response to the Central Highlands incident took several months to produce, which is to say it took exactly as long as these things always take when they involve questions that senior officers on both sides of an institutional boundary would prefer not to have answered in writing. The American side of the process required a senior 5th Group officer to review the captain's complaint, evaluate the colonel's position, and render a judgment on whether the credential question had been handled appropriately. The Canadian side of the process, operating through the informal channels available to it, required someone to make clear to someone else that the question had implications beyond the individual case. What the formal response said, when it finally arrived, was carefully worded in the way that formal military documents are always carefully worded when the institution needs to correct a mistake without admitting it was a mistake. It affirmed that the captain's qualifications were adequate for the position he had been assigned. It noted, in language that parsed with the precision of a legal brief, that the evaluation of special operations credentials should account for the full scope of a soldier's documented training and experience. It did not reprimand the colonel by name. It did not characterize his position as an error. It produced a guidance document, circulated to 5th Group headquarters elements, that addressed the question of prior foreign service and Allied training in terms that had not appeared in previous documentation. The language of that guidance document was, like all such language, a compromise between institutional honesty and institutional self-protection. But embedded within it, in a section addressing the evaluation of Allied officer qualifications for special operations assignments, was a passage that represented a quiet but significant acknowledgement. It stated that officers with documented service in Commonwealth or Allied Special Operations units, where that service included equivalent selection and training standards, should be evaluated on the basis of demonstrated capability rather than the specific national source of their credentials. It was not a sweeping reversal of institutional practice. It was not a formal apology to the Canadians who had served in American uniform and found their backgrounds discounted. It was 12 words stripped back to their institutional minimum and then padded with the qualifications that made them manageable. But it was there. The captain completed his second tour. He returned to a career in the Canadian Forces that his Vietnam service had, somewhat paradoxically, both expanded and complicated. Expanded, because 2 tours in Vietnam with American Special Forces had given him operational experience that almost no other officer in the Canadian Army of the early 1970s possessed. Complicated, because that experience had been accumulated in a war that Canada had officially declined to enter, under a flag that was not his own, and the Canadian Forces' institutional machinery had its own complicated feelings about men who had gone around it to find the war they were looking for. The 30,000 Canadians who served in American uniform during the Vietnam War received, for decades, essentially no official recognition from either country. The United States did not, in its formal accounting of the war, maintain statistics on Allied personnel who had enlisted individually rather than arriving through official government-to-government commitments. Canada did not, for most of the post-war period, acknowledge its Vietnam veterans as a distinct category deserving recognition, because acknowledging them required acknowledging that Canadians had served in a war the Canadian government had taken official positions against. The men themselves occupied a genuinely anomalous institutional position, too American for the Canadian memory of the war and too Canadian for the American memory of it. What the Central Highlands incident reveals, when you hold it up against the larger story of Canadians in Vietnam, is something that goes beyond the particulars of one colonel and one captain and one briefing room. It reveals the way that military institutions manage the boundaries of their own identity under stress. The American military of 1969 was an institution in profound crisis. Its strategy in Vietnam was not working by any measure that the civilian leadership had told the public it was using to measure success. Its casualty counts were rising. Its internal discipline was fraying, with drug use, racial tension, and what military historians would later call the breakdown of small unit cohesion becoming visible problems in conventional units throughout the country. The Special Forces, which had been insulated from some of these problems by their rigorous selection and their operational independence, were not immune to the institutional stress. They were being asked to do more with less, to train South Vietnamese forces who would eventually replace American combat power, while continuing to run the siege camps and the reconnaissance missions and all the other operations that had defined their Vietnam mission since the early 1960s. In this environment, the credential question was not really about credentials, it was about certainty. The colonel in that briefing room was not a stupid man or a cruel one. He was a man who needed to know, with as much confidence as possible, that the people he was sending into the field had been produced by a process he understood, evaluated by standards he recognized, and shaped by a professional culture he could read. The Q course was that process. Its standards were his standards. Its culture was his culture. A captain who had arrived at similar capabilities by a partially different route, through the Canadian Army's training systems and then through an accelerated American pipeline that had been designed for the unusual case rather than the standard one, was a man whose professional formation the colonel could not fully map. And things you cannot fully map, when the stakes are high enough, feel like risks you cannot afford to take. This is the institutional logic that produces the phrase, "your training doesn't count here." Not malice, not prejudice, or at least not primarily prejudice. Institutional anxiety, expressed as credential enforcement. The conviction that the standard exists to protect something real, combined with the failure to distinguish between the standard and the thing it was designed to protect. The thing the Special Forces qualification standard was designed to protect was not American institutional identity. It was operational competence. The Q course selected for and trained specific capabilities: physical endurance, technical skill, language ability, psychological resilience, the capacity for independent judgment under pressure, because those capabilities made A-teams effective in the field. A man who possessed those capabilities, demonstrated them in selection, honed them in training, and validated them in combat, possessed the thing the standard was designed to protect. Regardless of the national flag that had first put a rifle in his hands, the Canadian captain in that briefing room had done all of that. His service record said so in language that was, by any professional reading, unambiguous. The colonel's 7 words said something else. They said that the thing being protected was not purely operational competence. It was also something about the American character of the institution.
About the specific kind of formation that the American military recognized as having produced a qualified man. About the unspoken assumption rarely stated aloud because it was so embedded in the institution's self-image that stating it aloud would have required acknowledging it as an assumption, that the American way of making soldiers was the standard against which all other ways should be measured, and that any deviation from it, however small, however well compensated by demonstrated performance, was a deficit that required management.
The broader story of Allied forces in Vietnam is full of these moments. The Australian warrant officer handcuffed on a Vung Tau street by a military police sergeant, who read a Commonwealth rank badge as a sergeant's patch rather than as something categorically different. The Korean divisions that American commanders found infuriatingly independent, precisely because Korean military culture had developed its own ideas about how to conduct counterinsurgency in a way that was effective on Korean terms. The South Vietnamese officer, who had survived more years of continuous combat than most American generals, had months of command, being briefed on basic tactical concepts by an American advisor half his age. These moments share a common architecture. The larger institution, the American military, encountered the professional products of other institutional traditions and found them illegible in ways that the American institution read as deficiencies. The smaller parties, the Australians, the Koreans, the Canadians, the South Vietnamese, found the American institution's inability to read them infuriating in proportion to the clarity with which they could read themselves. The friction that resulted was not primarily about capability. It was about recognition. The question at the center of every one of these incidents was not, "What can this man do?" It was, "Who decided that this man could do it, and is that authority one that I recognize?" In Vietnam, that question mattered enormously, because the answer to it determined who sat at the table where decisions were made. It determined whose assessment of a tactical situation was treated as authoritative. It determined whose professional judgment was deferred to when the intelligence was ambiguous and the options were bad and someone had to decide. The American military's answer to that question, in 1969 as in the broader history of the war, was consistently and perhaps inevitably shaped by the assumption that the authority it recognized was primarily its own authority. Credentials it had issued, standards it had set, men it had formed. The Canadian captain was not alone in bumping against this assumption. He was not the first, and he was not the last. He was, in the specific context of the Central Highlands briefing room in the spring of 1969, simply the man who happened to be standing in front of it when it expressed itself, most clearly. The 7 words he heard across that table were the distillation of an institutional position that the American military had been maintaining, mostly without examining it, since the first Allied soldier arrived in Vietnam and discovered that the largest army in the theater had strong ideas about whose professional formation was legitimate. The guidance document that eventually resulted from his complaint was a small step toward examining that position. It was not a transformation. American military culture did not transform itself in response to a single captain's experience in a single briefing room, but it moved. Institutional cultures do not transform through dramatic reversals. They move in small increments, forced forward by the accumulated weight of incidents that reveal, with enough specificity and enough documented evidence, that a standard is being enforced in ways that have drifted from the purpose the standard was designed to serve. The Q course was designed to select and train men for a specific kind of war, the patient, intelligence-heavy, culturally sophisticated, small-unit kind of war that Special Forces doctrine had identified as the conflict of the Cold War era. A Canadian officer who had spent years in the Commonwealth military tradition, who had absorbed a professional culture that in many ways was more directly connected to the Malayan emergency and the counterinsurgency lessons that Special Forces doctrine claimed to embody, who had then completed the American qualification pipeline and 2 tours of combat to validate what that pipeline had confirmed about him, was not a deviation from what the Q course was designed to produce. He was, by any reasonable measure, an expression of exactly what it was designed to produce. The colonel who said your training doesn't count here was enforcing a standard. The guidance document that resulted from the captain's complaint was a reminder, addressed to every headquarters in the 5th Group, that the standard existed to protect a thing, and that the thing it was designed to protect was not the American military's exclusive ownership of legitimate professional formation. The thing it was designed to protect was the capability of the man in the field. And the man in the field, when you stripped away the credential questions and the institutional anxieties and the unexamined assumptions about who the American military was and was not, had already proven what he was capable of. He had proven it in selection. He had proven it in training. He had proven it in combat, in a Highland camp that he had helped hold through 2 tours while the institutional machinery that should have recognized him was busy enforcing a credential it had issued on a man it had partially formed. 7 words, spoken across a table covered in maps. Your training doesn't count here, Captain. The training, of course, was never really the question. It never is. The question is always the same one, in every briefing room, in every alliance, in every war. Who decided that this man counts? And the answer, when the institution is honest with itself, is never simply a piece of paper or a course completed or a standard passed. The answer is what the man did with all of it, in the places where papers and courses and standards cannot follow him, in the field, in the dark, in the kind of decisions that only the trained and tested and genuinely qualified can be trusted to make. The Canadian captain had already given his answer to that question. He had given it twice, across 2 tours in one of the most demanding operating environments the American military had ever entered. The colonel's 7 words did not change what the captain had already proven. They only revealed what the institution had not yet learned about its own standards and about the people those standards were supposed to serve. The guidance document exists. The captain's complaint exists. The broader record of 30,000 Canadians who served in a war their country declined to enter, who carried American weapons and earned American decorations and in some cases lost American lives without ever fully belonging to the institution they had joined, exists. And in that record, patient and documented and mostly unread, is the full weight of what it means to be a professional soldier in an alliance where the smallest partners have to prove, again and again, what the largest partner cannot bring itself to take on faith. The training always counted. The institution just needed time to say so.